about the vampire movie Black as Night. This one is directed by Matty Lee Goh and stars Aisha Cooper and Keith David. Now, this is somewhat similar to the recent Netflix movie Vampire vs. the Bronx. It focuses on a predominantly black cast, African-American cast, as they characters within that community of this kind of like low-income area dealing with what appears to be a kind of vampire outbreak. So the story focuses on this young girl who is meant to be a teenager, but she's actually played by someone in her kind of late 20s, and she is somewhat kind of awkward, we're meant to believe, and she has this kind of this friend and stuff, and they ended up going out one night, and she comes home on her own and is attacked by a gang of vampires. Now these vampires seem to be targeting specifically homeless people, and as we find out, there is this kind of vampire master who is, you know, basically taking the kind of the homeless people from around the area who will kind of go unnoticed and building an army of vampires, and it's up to this young girl to recruit a bunch of friends and see if she can kind of stop this kind of vampire menace. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So let's first of all discuss what works for this movie. I kind of quite like the idea of like a group of, you know, kids, even though they're not really kids in this film, you know, they're not played by kids in this film, but we've seen stuff like that, Stranger Things, the actual, as aforementioned, Vampires versus the Bronx did have a lot younger actors, very similar. But then there's, I always find them quite, you know, quite fun movies, things like the Monster Squad and that, kids kind of rising up to try and take matters into their own hands and kind of defeat the kind of the supernatural and stuff like that. It's a fun kind of concept, and you know, I quite enjoy those kind of like, they always seem to be slightly kind of like comedic and kind of upbeat and stuff. That's true of this film. I have to say I quite like the actual vampires here as well. I actually think they did a good job of both in the kind of the makeup department and some fantastically shot sequences. There's a scene towards the end of the movie where we kind of go into what appears to be like a crypt area, and it's fantastically spooky, and it's really, really well shot, I have to say, and makes for some great visuals. I also like the fact that this kind of has some tie-ins with a little bit of social commentary, but not enough to kind of like feel like it's too preachy. You know, it's a risky kind of move when you kind of do things like this, but obviously this movie is kind of coming at it from a certain point of view. But I think they do a good job here of associating some kind of like some problems that this kind of area has, and maybe where these kind of vampires have come from, and having it interweaved to make it an interesting kind of story, but without really sort of like smashing you over the head with social political issues and stuff to feel like you're going to be being preached to. I think it can more or less kind of hit the balance pretty right there. The cast is likeable, especially our main character. I thought she made a likeable protagonist, albeit I think she's somewhat miscast here, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But nonetheless, I couldn't help but kind of like her character, and I like the relationship between the friends and things like that. And you know, it's a relatively kind of well-paced movie with some kind of like fun effects and some kind of fun, interesting little jokey areas. For example, they assume that, for example, vampires can't come in unless they're invited, which in this instance doesn't seem to be the case. And there's just a little line delivery with that scene, which I thought was brilliant. So let's talk about what doesn't work in this movie, for me at least. So, like I've said, I think this movie is very, very similar to Vampires versus the Bronx. And I have to say, I think that movie did a better job of taking that kind of idea and kind of making it more of an interesting movie. Let's talk about the cast first of all. As I've said, I actually quite like the character, but I just feel like they're miscast here, because we're meant to believe our central protagonist is this somewhat kind of a wallflower and a little bit of an unpopular kid, things like this. But she's meant to be like, I don't know, teenager, 16, 17, something like that, I think. But she's played by someone who I believe was 28 at the time of this was made. So she kind of looks a lot older, and she certainly isn't like an unattractive girl. She's quite pretty, but she's meant to be like those, you know, cast as someone who is a little bit of a wallflower, a little bit of a down a few rungs on the social ladder, shall we speak. And I was kind of like, I'm not really getting that. There's also some very kind of specific kind of like things that are mentioned, jokes and kind of references that, to be honest with you, I didn't really get. There was things like, oh, she looks, there's a lot of talk about she looks Creole, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? I had to look it up afterwards, but apparently it's all to do with something like with beauty standards, whatever. So there was maybe a little bit of kind of restricted kind of language here outside of the market that it's made for, I suppose. So yeah, the casting, I think, you know, I like the characters, and I thought the acting was fairly good within the kind of the context of the movie. I just felt that they were a little miscast and a little poorly written. So, you know, our protagonist is clearly not an unattractive person and obviously too old for the role. Her kind of gay best friend is like a walking stereotype of kind of like gay stereotypes. You know, we have a couple of other characters that are introduced. We have like this white girl that's kind of introduced, but they don't really do anything with her, and she just disappears like partway through the movie and kind of has no real relevance on it. I was thinking, why even have that character? It just didn't seem to make any real sense to me. Why introduce her and then do absolutely nothing with them? And then we have these kind of like, we learn that there's different tribes of vampires, and we have a second tribe that is introduced, which kind of gives it a little bit of a wrinkle, a little bit like a kind of like a, that there's kind of stuff going on between these clans of vampires. And again, that was massively underused. It's something that was introduced, and you thought it's going to be like pertinent to the plot, and ultimately it doesn't really have a lot of relevance to it, to be quite honest. And I think the movie just isn't quite as fun as the aforementioned Vampires versus the Bronx. It's kind of just lacking that kind of spark, I think. And I think there's just the way it is constructed, it's just lacks a little bit of soul, a little bit of kind of like originality and like a fun vibe, really. It's watchable, I would say that. I like the kind of the vampire mythology within this movie, although I just think it has a lot of missed opportunities. It's like introduces stuff, and I think it has some good ideas and some concepts, and like, you know, if they want to use the actor, fine, but don't make her so she's a 16-year-old. Just make her older in the story and stuff like that. But or if you're going to have, if you want them to be young, cast more age-appropriate actors and stuff. So yeah, it just seems a little bit of a missed opportunity, but watchable. Like I said, the actual vampire stuff themselves, that involves the vampires, how they're kind of defeated and kind of fought against, and how they are affected with certain things like with garlic and stuff, I thought was good. And there's a scene where someone close to our main character dies, and I didn't really feel the impact was that well handled. And I also, in regards to that, and again I'm trying not to spoil anything here, in regards to the relationship of this main character's family, it didn't seem particularly kind of like well kind of thought out, is the best way I'd describe it. Again, I don't want to spoil anything for this, I'm trying to be vague. There's a family dynamic there where a certain family member is somewhere else, and it just seems like I find it quite unbelievable that the rest of the family would be willing to kind of turn a blind eye, if that makes sense. Overall, watchable, but ultimately somewhat kind of forgettable. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.